The distress signal came in at the worst possible hour, when the night cycle had dimmed every light on Valith Station, and most of the medical staff were deep in their rest pods. Head physician Solvrith was not resting. She stood at the observation deck with her 4 long fingers wrapped around a cup of thermal broth, watching the asteroid belt drift in silence, when the alarm screamed through the station like a wounded animal. Unidentified vessel, the station's intelligence announced in its calm, empty voice. Trajectory unstable, hull integrity at 4%, impact with station surface in approximately 9 minutes. Solvrith dropped her broth and ran. By the time she reached the command hub, her junior staff were already scrambling, their bioluminescent skin flickering between shades of panic blue and confusion white, which was the Kethron body's way of saying that nobody had any idea what was happening. "What species?" Solvrith demanded. "Unknown," the intelligence replied. "What do you mean, unknown?" "The vessel does not match any registered design in the Galactic Concordance database," head physician. That was not a comforting answer. The crash was louder than anything Solvrith had ever heard in her 60 years of practicing medicine on a quiet frontier station, and the tremor that followed knocked 3 of her staff off their feet and sent equipment sliding across the floor in every direction. Recovery teams moved fast because that was what they were trained to do, and within 20 minutes they had cut through the wreckage and pulled something out of it. Something that made every single one of them stop and stare. It was a body, roughly bipedal, with soft skin the color of wet sand and a mess of dark fibers growing from the top of its head, and it was covered in so much red fluid that at first Solvrith thought the creature had been dipped in paint. "That is blood," one of the recovery officers said, and his skin turned the pale green of nausea. "Iron-based blood," the medical scanner confirmed, and 2 of the junior doctors stepped back because iron-based blood was toxic to most species in the Concordance, and getting it on your skin was not something anyone wanted to experience. Solvrith looked at the body on the stretcher and felt something cold move through her chest. She had studied xenobiology for decades, and she had read every restricted file the Concordance kept locked behind clearance walls, and she knew what this creature was. She knew because there was only one species in the known galaxy that bled red and walked on 2 legs, and had that particular arrangement of features on its face. "That is a human," she said. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of a night cycle or the respectful silence of a memorial gathering, but the deep and terrible silence of people who had just realized that they were standing next to something from their nightmares. Humans were not common in this part of the galaxy, and most species preferred it that way because the stories about humans were the kind of stories that parents told their children when they wanted them to behave. "Stay in your sleep pod or the humans will come. Do not wander into restricted space or the humans will find you." They were stories, of course, just old tales told by traders and soldiers who had encountered humanity on the galactic frontier, but every story carried the same warning. Do not underestimate them. Do not corner them. And above all else, do not assume they are dead until you are absolutely certain, and even then check again. Solvrith stared at the medical readings and felt that cold thing in her chest grow larger, because the readings made no sense. The human's bones were broken in 11 places, and she could see the fractures on the scan like cracks in old glass, spreading through the skeleton in patterns that should have been instantly fatal. 3 of its internal organs were ruptured. Its brain had suffered a concussive event severe enough to shut down cognitive function in any known concordant species. And the blood loss was catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic, the kind of blood loss that did not leave survivors. By every medical standard Solvrith knew, by every textbook she had studied, and every case she had treated in 6 decades of work, this creature had been dead for at least 20 minutes. She was about to say exactly that when the heart monitor beeped. One beep, then another, steady and stubborn and impossible. "That cannot be correct," whispered Dreth, her most senior surgeon, and his skin had gone completely white, which meant he was more afraid than Solvrith had ever seen him. But the monitor did not care about what was correct or what was possible, because the monitor simply reported what was happening. And what was happening was that this shattered, bleeding, broken human was alive. And then Solvrith saw something that made her take a full step backward. The wounds were closing. Not quickly, not dramatically, nothing like the instant regeneration that some of the higher amphibian species could manage, but slowly and stubbornly, and with a kind of biological determination that Solvrith had never witnessed in any creature. Torn muscle fibers were reaching for each other across gaps that should have been permanent. Fractured bone edges were producing new calcium deposits at a rate that the scanner flagged as an error 3 times before accepting it was real. The human's immune system had woken up, and it was furious, sending battalions of white blood cells swarming toward every wound site like an army responding to an invasion, and the efficiency of it was terrifying. "It is healing itself," Dreth said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Yes," Solvrith said. "It should not be able to do that." "No," Solvrith said, "it should not." One of the youngest members of her staff, a recently graduated orderly named Pale, looked at the body on the table and then looked at Solvrith with enormous, frightened eyes. "What do we do?" Pale asked. That was the question, was it not? Solvrith could seal the medical bay and call the Concordance military authority and let them handle whatever this was, and that would be the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that every survival instinct in her body was screaming at her to make. But she was a doctor. She had taken an oath 43 years ago in the Hall of Mending on her homeworld, and that oath did not include the words, "Unless the patient frightens you," and it did not include the words, "Unless the patient is something you do not understand." The oath said heal. So Solvrith pulled on a fresh pair of surgical gloves and stepped toward the table and said, "We do our jobs." Her staff looked at her like she had lost her mind, and perhaps she had, but they followed her because that was what her staff did, and together they began working on the most impossible patient any of them had ever seen. They stabilized what they could, and supported the healing that was already happening, and tried very hard not to think about what they were going to do when this creature woke up. Solvrith leaned over the human's face and studied it, the strange flat features and the closed eyes and the dark fibers on its head, and she whispered a prayer to the pale cosmos. She prayed that the stories were exaggerated. She prayed that this creature would be grateful. She prayed that she was not making the worst mistake of her life. The human's eyes snapped open. They were brown, the color of tree bark on a dozen different worlds, and for one single heartbeat Solvrith saw something in them that was not pain or confusion or rage. She saw fear. And then the human screamed, and every light in the medical bay flickered, and Solvrith understood with perfect and terrible clarity that nothing on this station was ever going to be the same again. The scream lasted for 6 seconds, and it was the longest 6 seconds of Solvrith's life. It was not the scream of a creature that was afraid. Not exactly. It was the scream of a creature that had woken up in terrible pain, in a place it did not recognize, surrounded by beings it had never seen, and every single survival system in its body had fired at once like an engine pushed past its limit. The human thrashed against the restraints, and Solvrith watched in stunned silence as the reinforced polymer bands, designed to hold patients 3 times the size of this creature, bent under the force of its movements. "Increase the restraint strength," Solvrith ordered. "They are already at maximum," Dreth replied, and his voice was barely above a whisper. The human twisted and pulled, and the left restraint snapped clean off the table with a sound like a branch breaking, and Pale the young orderly stumbled backward into a supply cart and sent instruments clattering across the floor. Talk to it, Solvrith said suddenly. What? Dreth asked. Talk to it. Use universal standard. It is a spacefaring species, so it should have basic translation capability somewhere on its person or in its biology. Just talk to it. Dreth looked at her as if she had asked him to walk into a fire, but he stepped forward and said in the clearest universal standard he could manage. You are safe. You are in a medical facility. We are trying to help you. The human stopped thrashing. Its chest heaved up and down like a bellows, and its eyes darted around the room with a speed that made Solvrith's head spin, because she had never seen any creature process visual information that fast. The eyes moving from face to exit to instrument to face again in less than 2 seconds. Then the human spoke. Its voice was raw and rough and full of gravel, and it said one word in heavily accented universal standard. Where? Valith Station, Solvrith said carefully. You crashed on our surface approximately 1 hour ago. You were badly injured and we have been treating you. The human looked down at its own body, at the bandages and the monitoring leads and the remains of the restraints, and something shifted in its expression, something that Solvrith would later describe in her medical report as the single most unsettling thing she had ever witnessed. The human assessed its own catastrophic injuries with the calm, practiced eye of someone who had done this before. How bad? The human asked. You had 11 major bone fractures, 3 ruptured organs, severe cranial trauma, and you lost approximately 40% of your blood volume, Solvrith said. The human was quiet for a moment, and then it nodded as if she had told it something mildly inconvenient, like a delayed shuttle or a canceled meal. Could be worse, it said. Solvrith did not know how to respond to that, so she did what she always did when she was overwhelmed, and she focused on the medicine. Over the next several hours, her team ran every scan and test they could think of on the human, who eventually identified himself as Lieutenant Commander Mace Calloway of the United Nations Star Command Pathfinder Corps, and every single result that came back made the medical staff more afraid than the last. His bone density was extraordinary, nearly 3 times that of the average concordant species, which meant that the impact that had broken his skeleton in 11 places would have turned any other patient into powder. His muscle fibers were layered in a way that the scanner described as redundant combat architecture, which was a term Solvrith had never seen applied to a biological organism before because it was usually reserved for military vehicles. His immune system was unlike anything in the medical database, and it had already identified and begun attacking the sterilization nanites that the medical team had introduced into his bloodstream, tiny machines designed to prevent infection that had never once been rejected by any patient in the history of the station, and his white blood cells were dismantling them with a methodical brutality that made Dreth sit down and put his head in his hands. His body thinks our medicine is an invasion, Dreth said, and it is winning. But the thing that disturbed Solvrith the most was the chemical analysis of his blood. The human system was flooded with 2 substances that the Concordance Pharmacy had classified as Class 4 combat stimulants, chemicals so powerful that they were banned for use on military personnel in 6 different star systems because of the damage they caused to the body and the psychotic episodes they could trigger. The human was producing them naturally. His body made them on its own the way Solvrith's body made light when she was calm, except his body made chemicals that would qualify as illegal narcotics on most civilized worlds, and it did this every single time he was injured or frightened or angry, and it had been doing this his entire life. That is adrenaline, Calloway said when Solvrith asked him about it, and he said it the way someone might explain that water is wet, like it was the most obvious thing in the universe. Everyone has it. Everyone on your world, Solvrith corrected him. Right, Calloway said, and then he paused and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. You do not have it. No species in the concordance produces endogenous combat stimulants, Solvrith said. Calloway blinked at her, and then he said very quietly, "Oh." And in that single syllable Solvrith heard something that surprised her, because it was not pride or satisfaction, or the smugness of a predator, discovering that its prey was even weaker than it thought. It was loneliness. She excused herself and went to her office and locked the door and accessed the Concordance's restricted xenobiology archive using her highest clearance codes, and what she found there made her sit very still for a very long time. Humanity was not listed under sentient species. Humanity was not listed under spacefaring civilizations. Humanity was listed under a category that Solvrith had never seen used for any living thing in her entire career, a category she had assumed was theoretical, a relic from an older and more frightened age of galactic governance. The category was called Persistent Apex Predator Diplomatic Status. And the advisory note beneath it read, in bold text that had been updated 17 times in the last 100 years, "Do not engage unless necessary. Do not provoke under any circumstances. Do not assume they are incapacitated. Contact Concordance High Command immediately upon encounter." Solvrith read the file from beginning to end and learned about a species that had evolved on a world so hostile that it would be classified as a death planet by Concordance environmental standards, a world with extreme temperature variations and tectonic instability, and an atmosphere full of corrosive oxygen and oceans of salt water, and a biosphere that had spent millions of years trying to kill everything in it, including itself. And the humans had not just survived on this world. They had conquered it. They had conquered it, and then they had looked up at the stars and thought, "We should go there too." Solvrith closed the file and sat in silence, and then she stood up and walked back to the medical bay because her patient needed her. When she arrived, Calloway was sitting up in bed talking to Pale, who was standing at what he clearly believed was a safe distance, and the human was explaining something about his homeworld using slow, simple words and careful hand gestures, and Pale was listening with the wide-eyed fascination of a child hearing a story for the first time. "And the big ones we call whales," Calloway was saying. "They live in the ocean and they sing to each other." "They sing," Pale repeated. "Beautiful songs," Calloway said, and he smiled, and the smile changed his entire face from something frightening into something warm and tired and strangely gentle. Solvrith watched from the doorway and felt two completely opposite things at the same time. She felt the deep and ancient terror of a prey animal in the presence of something that could end her without effort. And she felt something else, something she did not expect, something that might have been the beginning of trust. Then the station's communication array chimed, and a cold military voice filled the room. "Valith Station, this is Commander Vosk of the Dralith Hegemony Patrol. We have detected an unauthorized crash event on your surface, and we are inbound to contain the situation. Prepare for boarding." Solvrith looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at Solvrith. And in his eyes she saw that he understood exactly what "contain the situation" meant, and for one brief terrible moment she saw the thing that lived behind the smile, the thing that the Concordance files had warned her about, the thing that had survived a death world and conquered the stars. Then it was gone, and he was just a tired, injured man in a hospital bed. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I think I just made things very complicated for you." Solvrith wanted to disagree, but she could not because he was absolutely right. Commander Vosk's ship was a Dralith Interceptor, a sharp and angular vessel built for intimidation rather than grace, and it docked with Valith Station with the aggressive precision of a predator closing its jaws around something small. Solvrith met him at the airlock with her back straight, and her bioluminescence carefully controlled to show nothing but professional calm, even though her insides felt like they were dissolving. Vosk was tall even by Dralith standards, nearly 8 feet of scaled muscle and rigid posture, with eyes like chips of black ice, and a voice that sounded like stones grinding together. "Where is the creature?" he said, and he did not say it like a question. "The patient is in my medical bay under active care." Solvrith replied, "It is not a patient, it is a security threat, and I am here to neutralize it." "Neutralize," Solvrith repeated, and she felt something hot and sharp bloom in her chest because she had spent the last several hours fighting to keep this creature alive, and she had not done that just to hand him over to someone who used the word neutralize the way other people use the word lunch. "Commander Vosk, the being in my medical bay is a sentient creature who crashed on this station through no hostile action of his own. He is injured and he is under my care, and I will not release him to you." Vosk looked down at her the way a mountain might look down at a pebble. "You do not have a choice, physician." "Actually, I do," Solvrith said, and she pulled from her memory something she had not thought about since her second year of medical training, a law so old that most people had forgotten it existed. "I invoke the oath of sanctuary." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. Even Vosk's soldiers, 4 armored Draelith standing behind him like statues made of metal and bad intentions, shifted uncomfortably. The Oath of Sanctuary was one of the founding laws of the Galactic Concordance, written into the Charter over 1,000 years ago, and it stated in language that left no room for interpretation that no patient under active medical care could be seized by military force for any reason under any circumstances. It had not been invoked in over 300 years. "You cannot be serious," Vosk said. "I am completely serious," Solvrith said. "The patient remains under my care and under the protection of this station until I determine that treatment is complete. That is the law, Commander, and I do not care how many soldiers you brought with you." Vosk's jaw tightened, and for one terrible moment Solvrith thought he was going to hit her right there in the corridor. But instead he leaned forward until his face was close enough that she could smell the metal on his breath. "You have 12 hours, he said. 12 hours to conclude your treatment, and then I am coming in there and I am taking that thing off your station in whatever condition it happens to be in at that time, and if it resists, I will put it down like the animal it is." He turned and walked back toward his ship, and his soldiers followed, and the airlock sealed behind them with a sound like a tomb closing. Solvrith stood alone in the corridor for a long time before she trusted her legs to carry her back to the medical bay. Calloway was sitting up when she returned, and she could tell from the look on his face that he had heard everything because of course he had. The man's hearing was apparently as absurdly capable as the rest of him. 12 hours, he said. "Yes. You should not have done that for me." "Probably not," Solvrith agreed. "Why did you?" She thought about it for a moment and then she said, "Because I am a doctor and you are my patient, and that is all there is to it." Calloway looked at her for a long time and then he nodded once slowly, with a gravity that suggested the gesture meant something important in his culture. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out heavy and rough like they had to fight their way past something in his throat. The hours that followed were strange and quiet, and nothing like what Solvrith had expected. Calloway did not pace or panic or make demands. Instead, he did something that confused the entire staff. He helped. When young Pale struggled to move a heavy equipment cart from one side of the bay to the other, Calloway stood up from his bed, walked over on legs that had been shattered less than a day ago, and pushed the cart into position with one hand. When one of the monitoring systems threw an error that the night technician could not figure out, Calloway leaned over and looked at the screen and said, "That wire there, the blue one, it has come loose from the connector, happens on our ships all the time," and he was right. When the kitchen unit delivered meal trays and the staff sat down to eat in tense silence, Calloway told a story about a time his commanding officer had accidentally sat on the ship's emergency broadcast button and sent a distress signal to an entire fleet during a training exercise, and the fleet had arrived in full combat formation, only to find one very embarrassed captain trying to explain that he had simply been looking for a comfortable place to sit. The story did not translate perfectly, and some of the cultural references were lost, but the image of a flustered military commander trying to explain himself to an entire armed fleet was apparently universal because Pale laughed so hard that broth came out of his nose, which was an experience neither species had expected to share. Solvrith watched all of this from her office doorway, and she felt the fear in her chest shifting into something more complicated. Then she noticed the scars. Calloway's medical gown had shifted while he was helping with the equipment cart, and she could see his torso, and what she saw there made her go very quiet. Scars, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, layered over each other in a map of violence that stretched across his entire body. Burn marks, old and faded but still visible. Long, thin lines that could only have come from bladed weapons. Rough circular patches where the skin had been rebuilt after something had torn through it. And beneath all of that, the telltale ridges of bones that had been broken and healed and broken again, some of them multiple times, like a wall that kept getting knocked down and rebuilt. Calloway caught her looking, and for a moment something passed across his face, not shame exactly, but a kind of tired acknowledgement. "Occupational hazard," he said with a small shrug. "How many times have you been injured like this?" Solvrith asked. Calloway considered the question. "I stopped counting after the 14th major incident," he said, "somewhere around my 5th year of service." "And you continued?" "Of course." "Why?" He looked at her as if the question genuinely puzzled him. "Because people needed me too," he said simply. Solvrith returned to her office and sat in her chair and pressed her 4 hands together and tried to make sense of what she was feeling. She had read the files and she knew what this man was, what his species was, what they were capable of, and the files were not wrong because she had seen the bent restraints and the impossible healing, and the way his eyes had tracked every exit in the room within 2 seconds of waking up. He was dangerous. He was the most dangerous thing that had ever been on the station. But he was also the man who had pushed a cart for a young orderly and told a funny story to ease the tension in a room and said thank you with a voice that cracked. And those 2 things existed inside the same body, and Solvrith did not know what to do with that. The 12 hours were running out. Solvrith gathered her staff in the small chapel room adjacent to the medical bay, a quiet space with soft light that the Kethron used for reflection and prayer, and she looked at their faces, their skin flickering with every shade of fear and confusion and exhaustion. "When the time runs out," Solvrith said, "Vosk will come through that door and he will try to take our patient." "Can we stop him?" Dreth asked. "No," Solvrith said, "but the human might." Silence. "You have all read the files," she continued. "You have all seen what his body can do, and you have all seen the way he reacted when he heard Vosk threaten this station. I saw his face and I saw what was behind it, and I am telling you now that if Vosk comes in here with weapons drawn, the human will fight." "He is still injured," Pale said quietly. "Yes," Solvrith said, "and I do not think that will matter." She paused and looked at the small shrine at the front of the chapel, the carved symbol of the pale cosmos that her people had prayed to for 10,000 years. "I am going to pray," she said, "and I am not going to pray for the human because I have seen enough today to know that the human does not need my prayers." She knelt. "I am going to pray for us," she said. "I am going to pray that this station survives what is about to happen inside it, and I am going to pray that when it is over, the human remembers that we were kind to him." One by one, her staff knelt beside her. The lights in the chapel dimmed to a soft glow, and the Kethron prayed in silence while somewhere in the medical bay a human sat alone on a hospital bed and flexed his healing hands and listened to the clock count down. And then the airlock alarm screamed through the station. Vosk was early. Vosk came through the airlock with 12 soldiers behind him. They were Draelith shock troopers, each one encased in powered combat armor that hummed with energy. And they moved through the corridors of Valeth Station with the mechanical precision of creatures who had trained for nothing but violence their entire lives. Solvrith met them in the main corridor outside the medical bay, because she had to try one more time even though she already knew how this was going to end. "Commander Vosk, the 12 hours have not expired. You are in violation of the Oath of Sanctuary." Vosk did not slow down. "The oath is a relic," he said, "and I have received authorization from Hegemony Command to disregard it in matters of galactic security." "That authorization does not exist." "It does now." Solvrith planted herself in front of the medical bay doors and spread her arms and said, "I will not let you pass." She weighed perhaps 90 pounds, and she stood barely 5 feet tall, and her bones were hollow like a bird's, and she was standing in front of 8 feet of armored military commander, and she did not move. Vosk looked down at her with something that might have been annoyance or might have been amusement, and then he backhanded her across the face with one armored fist. The blow sent Solvrith spinning into the wall, and she hit it hard and slid to the floor, and tasted something warm and metallic in her mouth, and heard Pale cry out from somewhere behind her. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the medical bay doors open. Through the observation glass, from where she lay crumpled on the floor, she saw the human stand up. She had watched Calloway for hours now, and she had seen his warmth and his humor and his gentleness, and she had started to think that maybe the files were exaggerated after all, that maybe he was just a man, a strange and durable man, but just a man. She was wrong. What stood up from that hospital bed was not the man who had told funny stories and pushed equipment carts and said thank you with a cracking voice. The change happened in less than 2 seconds, and it was the most frightening thing Solvrith had ever witnessed because it was so quiet. The pain left his face like someone had wiped it clean with a cloth. His breathing, which had been slightly labored all day, suddenly slowed to a deep and steady rhythm. His hands, which had been trembling slightly from residual nerve damage, went completely still. And his eyes changed. Solvrith had seen those brown eyes express fear and gratitude and loneliness and humor in the hours since he had woken up, but now they expressed nothing at all. Nothing except a focus so absolute and so cold that looking into them was like looking into the barrel of a weapon. The chemical monitors on his bed screamed alerts as his body dumped adrenaline and cortisol into his bloodstream at levels that the system classified as critical toxicity warning. Except for him, it was not toxicity. It was fuel. Calloway pulled the IV from his arm without flinching, and he stood on legs that had been broken 14 hours ago, and he rolled his shoulders once, and Solvrith heard something pop back into place, and he walked toward the door. Not ran. Walked. Vosk's soldiers entered the medical bay in standard Draelith breach formation, 2 columns of 6, weapons raised, moving with practiced coordination. The first soldier through the door was 8 feet tall, and wearing armor rated to withstand direct plasma fire, and he was carrying a suppression rifle that could drop a charging beast at 400 meters. Calloway took the rifle out of his hands. It happened so fast that Solvrith's eyes could not track it. One moment the soldier was armed, and the next moment Calloway had the weapon, and in the same fluid motion, he swung it like a club into the soldier's knee joint where the armor was thinnest, and the soldier went down with a sound like a building collapsing. The second and third soldiers fired. Calloway was not where they aimed. He had moved, not with the blinding speed of species that were built for quickness, but with something worse, with the adaptive, intelligent movement of a creature that was reading the geometry of the room and the positions of every threat, and calculating the optimal path through all of it in real time. He used the fallen soldier as cover, and then he was among them, and at close range the Draelith formation fell apart because their training was built around maintaining distance, and using superior firepower, and this human was inside their guard, and he was not giving them space to recover. Calloway fought the way water moves through broken rock, finding every gap and every weakness and flowing into it before it could close. He targeted joints and connections, and the soft points between armor plates with a precision that said he had studied Draelith armor before, or he was figuring it out as he went, and Solvrith honestly did not know which possibility was more terrifying. A plasma bolt caught him across the ribs, and Solvrith saw the skin split and the red blood flow, and she waited for him to fall. He did not fall. He grabbed the arm of the soldier who had shot him and twisted it until the armor's servos screamed, and the weapon fell from nerveless fingers, and then he drove his elbow into the soldier's helmet with enough force to crack the visor. A concussive grenade went off 3 feet from him, and the blast threw him sideways into a wall, and he hit it hard enough to dent the metal paneling, and Solvrith heard at least one of his newly healed ribs break again. He got up. And he kept moving, and the medical staff watched on the monitoring screens in horrified silence as this broken, bleeding, impossible creature continued to dismantle a fully armed tactical squad with nothing but his bare hands and a stolen rifle that he was using as a blunt instrument, because he had apparently decided that shooting people was not how he wanted to handle this. And Solvrith realized something that made the fur on the back of her neck stand straight up. He was not trying to kill them. Every strike was aimed at joints, at mobility, at the ability to continue fighting, and not once did he target a throat or a head or a vital organ. And for the Draelith, whose entire military doctrine was built around total annihilation, this was incomprehensible. He was taking them apart like a mechanic disassembling machines, and he was doing it with a restraint that was somehow more frightening than brutality would have been, because it meant he was in complete control. It meant he was choosing exactly how much damage to inflict and exactly where to inflict it, and he was choosing not to kill. Pale stood beside Solvrith watching the screens and said in a very small voice, "Why will it not stop?" And Solvrith heard herself answer in a voice she did not entirely recognize, "Because it is human." The fight lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, 11 Draelith shock troopers lay on the floor of Valith Station in various states of incapacitation, all alive, all breathing, none of them able to stand, and the corridor looked like a storm had passed through it. Calloway walked through the airlock onto Vosk's gunship, and found the commander on the bridge reaching for the ship's weapons console. "Step away from that," Calloway said. Vosk spun around and drew his sidearm, and fired in one motion. The bolt hit Calloway in the left shoulder and spun him halfway around, and he made a sound through his teeth that might have been pain and might have been annoyance, and then he closed the distance between them in 2 steps, and took the weapon out of Vosk's hand the way an adult takes a dangerous object from a child. Vosk stared at him, and for the first time the commander's rigid composure cracked, and Solvrith, who was watching through the ship's internal cameras, saw real fear on a Draelith face for the first time in her life. Calloway held the sidearm for a moment, and then he set it down on the console very carefully, and he looked at Vosk, and said in a voice that was quiet and steady, and carried absolutely no emotion at all, "You hit the doctor." Vosk said nothing. "I am going to leave now," Calloway said. "You are going to let me, and you are going to apologize to her. And if you ever raise a hand to someone under the protection of a medical oath again, I will come back and this conversation will be very different." He turned his back on the armed commander and walked away, and that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant he did not consider Vosk a threat. He walked back through the airlock and back through the ruined corridor and back into the medical bay, and he stood in the doorway swaying slightly with blood running down his arm and his ribs visibly broken beneath his torn medical gown. Solvrith looked up at him from the floor where she was still sitting with a bruise spreading across her face. Calloway smiled at her, and just like that the warmth was back in his eyes as if someone had turned a light on behind them. "I think I pulled my stitches," he said. And then his legs gave out and he collapsed in the doorway, and Pale rushed forward and Dreth grabbed a crash cart, and Solvrith pushed herself up off the floor and limped to his side, and they went to work again, because that was what they did. And as she leaned over her impossible patient and began repairing the damage he had done to himself, while repairing the damage Vosk had tried to do to all of them, Solvrith realized that her hands were not shaking. She was not afraid anymore. She was something else entirely, and she did not yet have a word for it. The Galactic Concordance moved fast when it wanted to, and in the days following the incident on Valeth Station, it moved very fast indeed. A diplomatic envoy arrived within 36 hours, a sleek vessel carrying representatives from 4 different species, and enough legal authority to make Commander Vosk's career disappear, which is exactly what happened. Vosk was court-martialed, not for attacking the human because the Concordance Military Tribunal understood very well that pressing charges for that would require acknowledging that 12 heavily armed shock troopers had been defeated by a single unarmed patient in a hospital gown, and nobody wanted that in the official record. He was court-martialed for violating the Oath of Sanctuary, which was an easier charge and a cleaner story, and it accomplished the same goal of making sure Vosk never commanded anything more dangerous than a supply shuttle for the rest of his life. The incident was classified at the highest level, which meant that officially it had never happened, and Solvrith understood why, because the galaxy was not ready to see security footage of a human doing what Calloway had done. Not because it would make them fear humans. They already feared humans, but because it would make them ask questions that the Concordance did not want to answer, questions like why the most dangerous species in the galaxy had shown more restraint in 4 minutes of combat than most military forces showed in an entire campaign, and what it meant that a creature capable of that kind of violence had chosen to leave every single one of his enemies alive. Those were complicated questions, and the Concordance preferred simple answers. 3 days after the incident, a UNSC recovery vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Valeth system, and it was the most beautiful and the most terrifying ship Solvrith had ever seen. It was not large by military standards, but it moved with a confidence that suggested it did not need to be large, and when it hailed the station, the voice on the other end was calm and professional and said simply, "This is the UNSC Pathfinder vessel Resolute. We are here to collect our officer. Thank you for taking care of him." Thank you for taking care of him. 7 words, and Solvrith felt the weight of all of them. Calloway was healing at a rate that continued to astonish the medical staff, and by the 3rd day, he was walking without assistance and eating solid food, and doing something he called push-ups on the floor of the medical bay, which involved lowering and raising his entire body weight using only his arms, and which Pale watched with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters. "Why are you doing that?" Pale asked. "Keeps the muscles from getting stiff," Calloway said between repetitions. "You were clinically dead 3 days ago." "Exactly. I have lost a lot of conditioning. I need to get it back." Pale looked at Solvrith with an expression that clearly said, "Do you see what I have to deal with?" And Solvrith almost laughed, because 3 days ago she would not have believed she could find anything about this situation funny. On his last day aboard the station, Calloway did something that none of the staff expected. He visited each of them individually. He went to Dreth first and thanked him for the surgical work, and asked detailed questions about the techniques used, and complimented the precision of the bone-knitting procedure. And Dreth, who had been afraid of Calloway since the moment he arrived, found himself engaged in a genuine medical discussion that lasted 20 minutes, and ended with both of them agreeing that Kethron microsuture technology was superior to human methods in at least 3 significant areas. He went to the night technician and apologized for bleeding on his equipment. He went to the kitchen staff and told them that the nutrient broth they had prepared for him was better than anything he had eaten on a UNSC vessel in 6 years, and asked if he could have the recipe. And the kitchen staff, who were small and timid, and had been hiding in the back since his arrival, gave him a data chip with the recipe and a container of extra broth for his trip, and they were glowing pink with pride when he left. He went to Pale last. The young orderly was restocking supplies in the storage room, and he looked up when Calloway appeared in the doorway, and for a moment the old fear flickered across his face. Calloway sat down on a supply crate so that he was at Pale's eye level instead of towering over him, and he said, "I want to tell you something." Pale swallowed and nodded. "When I woke up on that table," Calloway said, "I was more afraid than I have ever been in my life, and I have been afraid a lot of times, but I woke up in a strange place surrounded by people I had never seen before, and everything hurt, and I did not know if you were going to help me or hurt me." He paused. "And then I saw you," he said, "standing there with your big eyes and your supply cart, looking just as scared of me as I was of everything else, and I thought, that one is all right, that one is not going to hurt me, I can tell." Pale's skin turned a soft, warm gold that Solvrith had never seen on him before. "You were the first person in this place who made me feel like I might be safe," Calloway said, "and I will not forget that." Then he stood and left, and Pale stood alone in the storage room for a very long time, glowing gold. Calloway's last stop was Solvrith's office. He knocked on the door frame even though the door was open, because humans apparently considered it rude to enter without signaling even when they were invited, and Solvrith thought about how strange it was that a species that could punch through armor plating also had elaborate social rituals about doorways. "Come in," she said. Calloway entered and stood in front of her desk, and he was wearing a clean uniform that the Resolute had sent over, dark fabric with silver markings, and he looked like a different creature than the broken, bleeding thing they had pulled from the wreckage. He looked solid and real and present in a way that made the room feel smaller. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal pin, no larger than Solvrith's thumb, shaped like a star with a medical symbol at its center. "This is a Pathfinder Corps medic badge," he said. "It is given to field medics who have saved the life of a Pathfinder under fire." "I am not a soldier," Solvrith said. "No," Calloway agreed. "You are something better. You are a doctor who stood between her patient and a man with a gun and did not move, and where I come from that means you are one of us." He placed the pin on her desk very gently. "You kept me alive when you did not have to," he said. "You protected me when it would have been easier and safer not to, and you did it because of an oath you took 43 years ago that you have never once broken." He looked at her with those brown eyes, and Solvrith saw something in them that went deeper than gratitude, something that burned slow and steady like a star at the core of him. "That matters," he said. "That matters more than you know." Solvrith picked up the pin and held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, and understood that this small piece of metal meant more to this man than any treaty or formal alliance ever could. "Thank you, Mace," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name. He smiled, and for a moment he was not a persistent apex predator or a classified security threat or the most dangerous thing the galaxy had ever produced. He was just a man who was glad someone had been kind to him. He left an hour later aboard the Resolute, and Solvrith watched the ship climb away from the station until it was nothing but a point of light among the stars. 2 weeks later, she received a formal communication from the United Nations Star Command ambassador to the Galactic Concordance, and it read, "We noticed. We appreciate you handling it." 7 words. Her military liaison told her later with slightly shaking hands that those 7 words had resulted in the restructuring of an entire Draelith naval command, because the implication behind them was not gratitude. It was a reminder. A quiet and polite and absolutely terrifying reminder that humanity was paying attention, and humanity had a very long memory, and humanity did not forget the people who helped them, and did not forget the people who did not. Solvrith wrote her medical report over the following month, and it was the most widely circulated classified document in Concordance history. In it, she wrote many things about human biology and human resilience, and the impossible durability of a species that had evolved on a world that tried to kill them every single day. But the part that was quoted most often in the councils and academies and military briefing rooms of 100 different worlds was her conclusion. She wrote that humans did not possess the strongest bodies in the galaxy. She wrote that they did not have the fastest reflexes, or the most advanced biology, or the most sophisticated technology. She wrote that what they possessed instead was something that no other species had ever demonstrated to the same degree, a quality that was not captured by any single word in any language she knew, but that she would attempt to describe as the absolute and total refusal to stop. They did not stop healing when their bodies should have given up. They did not stop fighting when the odds said they should have surrendered. They did not stop caring when the universe gave them every reason to turn cold. And that, she wrote, was what made them the most dangerous and the most extraordinary species the galaxy had ever encountered. Not their strength or their fury, but their stubborn and relentless and utterly irrational insistence on getting back up every single time they were knocked down, and doing it with kindness still intact. 3 months after that, a package arrived at Valeth Station with no return address but a UNSC postal stamp. Inside was a small ceramic pot containing a yellow flower with a broad face and strong stem, and a handwritten note in messy, imperfect universal standard characters. The note read, "Doc, they tell me this flower always turns to face the light. Reminded me of you. Stay stubborn, Mace." Solvrith placed the flower on her desk next to the medic pin, and she touched the petals with her fingertips and she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. She turned to the observation window and looked out at the stars, the vast and endless dark that she had stared into for 60 years, and for the first time in her life she did not find it frightening. Because somewhere out there in that enormous black was a species that bled red and broke bones and healed them back and told jokes in languages that did not translate and pushed carts for people who were afraid of them and wrote thank you notes in bad handwriting and gave away medals to doctors who were just doing their jobs. Somewhere out there were the humans. And if they were out there, then the dark did not seem so dark after all. Solvrith opened her journal and wrote her final entry on the matter, the one that would not appear in any official report, but that she would keep on her desk for the rest of her career beside a yellow flower and a small metal star. "I used to pray the humans would never find us," she wrote. "Now I pray they never forget us." She closed the journal and watched the stars and the flower on her desk turn slowly toward the light.